How is everybody out there in audio-only podcast land? I am your host, Jason Miles, and this is another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. And this was a fun show. This is one of my favorite people to have on the show. Randy Shaw, who is in this episode, is the author of the book Generation Priced Out. He's also the author of the Activist Handbook. Randy has been a housing advocate, an advocate for the unhoused for 40 plus years. And his book Generation Priced Out is not just the story of what is gentrification, how we got there, but it's also a book of some solutions. Real people that try to solve real problems don't just sit around and constantly critique. They actually get in there and do real work. So I first discovered Randy's work. There's this internet news blog called the LA Progressive. And sometimes they take articles from different publications. I think Pascal's been on there, actually. Definitely Margaret Kimberly has. The earlier days of the show, I would find some people on there that were willing to come on. That's it. It fits. The title fits for it. It's not a total, for those of us here that are of the tanky variety, if that's what you are. It's probably not a magazine for you if you want to just see some tanky shit. And some of the takes in there are not always the best. But Randy has some good articles always on the housing situation, especially in California. And there's a couple places I think are good places to go for the housing situation. One at LA Times does really good work, actually. The people we've met at the LA Tenants Union, Tracy Rosenthal, let's say her, slur her name. Tracy Rosenthal wrote a real good piece on some of the issues with housing from a Marxist perspective. I think Randy at this point in his life has kind of abandoned. I mean, he always has an analysis, right? But he's not going to say things like from a Marxist perspective too much because, he knows that for some people that could be troubling. But Randy is definitely of the left. And the hour flew by. Pascal and I had some really good questions we wanted to ask about gentrification. Of course, Pascal wanted to get in the weeds about a lot of areas, a lot of urban areas with a black political class also have gentrifying problems. Atlanta, historically. A lot of that comes from bringing in businesses and having a private sector lift up a burgeoning middle class after 68. So in the early 70s, you're starting to see a burgeoning black middle class in places like Atlanta, who also has their first black mayor. But that burgeoning black middle class comes from the private sector, opposed to places like New York, who also has a burgeoning middle class, but that middle class is working primarily in the public sector. So their voting blocks are going to be more aligned with poor and working class voters because they need to keep those programs, the programs that employ them to literally police and check on their poor and working class brethren. not so much in places like Atlanta. And it's very sad when you think about the scandal that rocks that mayor's legacy. And say what you will about Maynard Jackson in Atlanta. I don't have that long to get into a critique. But the Atlanta child murders is kind of his legacy, outside of being the first black mayor. And what happens to a lot of the public housing where these young children were getting abducted from? It's gone. But definitely had a great conversation with Randy Shaw about housing, gentrification, his hopes for the Biden infrastructure bill, which has a very large housing budget in it. And he brings up a very interesting point on the show. He says homelessness blows up really bad during Reagan. He says you start to see it during Nixon, but Reagan, eliminating a lot of Section 8 shit, gets bad, and it gets worse under Clinton and Obama. And he said no president campaigned on a housing platform. He's like, from 1980 on. So enjoy this conversation. In the bonus patron half, it was nuts. We did a call-in show. So if you're a patron, get ready for that one. If you're not a patron, become a patron. There's links in the description. You know what the music means. I gotta shut up now. Peace. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast, coming at you all the way live from somewhere in the Central Coast. And I want to get right down to it because Pascal and I have both crafted a ton of questions for our guest today, our returning guest. For those new people to the show, even before Pascal was on the show and it was just strictly an audio-only podcast, Randy Shaw has been on the show because I worked in housing and with the unhoused, and have always loved what Randy has to say. He's been a long-time activist in that world and has wrote several books and papers about it. So, without any further ado, let me bring in my homie, my dog, Mr. Pascal Robert.
What a way to start the show. Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
My setup is not ergonomically correct for the board. That's why you get less sound effects now.
I understand.
Lucky for you.
It's okay.
And I probably need to close this window as my neighbors are screaming at the ball game. Are you ready for today's show?
Yes, I am.
Well, we had Randy on with you. Was it just me and you and Randy once?
Yeah, we had Randy Shaw on before with me and you. You had him on. You had him on when you was just audio, but he was on with the both of us once before as well.
So I'm excited that he gets to come back as the show is bigger, the audience is bigger, more people get to hear what he's got to say. So chat if you have any questions for Randy, and I think you guys will. We're going to be doing a call-in for the bonus Patron After Hours segment. So if you guys have some real pressing stuff you want to get at, we'll take your calls. And you know the rules. Got to pay for this shit by the second, so you got 2 minutes to get that shit off your chest. Now, we made a video, as we usually do, to get you guys ready for this. And in this video, I found some really good raw footage of Ronald Reagan on the campaign trail before he became president in 1980 in the Bronx. And it's an amazing exchange because I don't know if you would see this level of exchange now. Can you imagine a modern day candidate doing something like this now, Pascal?
No.
So Ronald Reagan is kind of, and this is before he gets shot, of course. So Ronald Reagan is just there in the Bronx in front of kind of the ashes of a torn down building. And all these residents are just yelling at him to the point where he gets frustrated. It's like 20 minutes long. I wish I could play the whole thing for you because the whole 20 minutes is just full of gems from the people and Reagan. But ultimately, Reagan is explaining to these people that the answer to their problems is him giving tax breaks to private business and bringing in industry. And then you'll see it. You'll see it.
I don't know that the Klan has endorsed me. Well, I can tell you I don't endorse them. There's no place in America where it's anything like that.
Mr. Reagan, Ronald Reagan, please.
Mr. Reagan. Let me ask you.
Everybody,
I know. Yes.
Mr. Reagan, please, I got a question for you.
But I heard your question. Let me try to answer. Listen. Wait a minute.
Please, cool it down, cool it. The man got something to say, cool it.
Will you hold it down on the count of, I'm getting pretty hoarse. I've been making...
1928 was a good building year. Almost $3 billion worth of new residential construction saw the light of day. But in 1929, even before the Depression became general, building dropped off to slightly under $2 billion. Year after year throughout the Depression, this decline continued. Each succeeding drop meaning thousands more men laid off in the building and allied industries. Until in 1934, all of the new homes built in the United States were worth only $227 million. A decline of 92% from 1928. But due to the stimulation of the National Housing Act, 1935 presents a different picture. From every section of the country come reports of vastly increased building activity.
The economic shock of the COVID pandemic, homelessness and affordable housing was becoming a major issue in many blue cities and states across the country. With the eviction moratorium lifted, what protections do poor and working class people have to stave off homelessness in gentrifying cities? A recent U.S. Census Bureau household pulse survey is estimating we could have 4.3 million Americans evicted and foreclosed on in the coming months. Will the Biden Build Back Better infrastructure bill be enough to curb this potential homelessness crisis? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
I am sending Congress a plan that will give every responsible homeowner in America the chance to save about $3,000 a year on their mortgage by refinancing at historically low rates. No more red tape. No more runaround from the banks. And a small fee on the largest financial institutions will make sure it doesn't add to our deficit. Now, I want to be clear, this plan, like the other actions we've taken, will not help the neighbors down the street who bought a house they couldn't afford and then walked away and left a foreclosed home behind. It's not designed for those who acted irresponsibly, but it can help those who acted.
Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out. You can count. That's true. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Do it now, please. All right. That being said, without any further ado, he is the man that wrote the book that unfortunately is at my dad's. I had to rebuy that shit. So I bought 2 copies, Randy. The author of Generation Priced Out. Longtime housing rights activist. Please welcome Randy Shaw.
Well, thank you for again having me, Jason. Great video to start the show.
I'm glad you like it. Glad you like it. Took longer than people think combing through footage about housing with Reagan and Barack Obama. And I've also found that newsreel clip from 1939 about the New Deal housing, which was pretty cool. Well, we're happy to have you here. I'm sure the chat is going to blow up with a bunch of questions once we start asking our questions. Did you want to go first, Pascal? Or you want me to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take Randy to a place of questioning.
Okay.
So, Randy, I want to ask you, I mean, in reading your book and the articles, particularly the one on the recent election in California, I sense, particularly from your book, that there is an increasing amount of activism around housing that you are recording in your book early on that you would know better than I, as a longtime housing activist, has been unseen in American history. What do you think are the driving forces behind this growth in housing activism? And do you think the race and class makeup of the current wave of housing activists are going to be able to target the problem of racialized gentrification that we see in many urban areas affecting Black and Brown communities?
Well, that's a big question. Let me just start with why I think there's been a big increase in housing activism. I mean, the increase really started in response to the second dot-com boom that began like in 2015, where rents and housing prices in every major city were going up. And that displaced people, caused people unable to afford housing where they wanted to live. They had to move further away from their jobs. And then we had on top of that, the COVID eviction crisis involving millions. So we have a combination of an eviction crisis due to COVID, mass unemployment, with rising rents in blue cities, which I talk about in my book. And so, I mean, I was saying before the show how critical I was of Barack Obama for not making even an attempt to fund a solution to homelessness in 2009 when Democrats controlled the entire legislature. It wasn't even an attempt to do so in 2009, 2010. So there's no can't blame Republicans for that. We didn't have the infrastructure at the national level. It was pre-internet where people were really connected. Since really 2000, the start of the primaries and the Democratic primaries in 2020, Housing has been a front burner issue more than it's ever been in any presidential primary year ever. And Biden's Build Back Better plan is the greatest investment in housing we've seen since the New Deal. And, you know, when that plan was announced, I was saying, you know, this is the first time in my lifetime, and really in anybody's lifetime, that we have a chance to end homelessness, meaningfully end homelessness, most homelessness in America. But as we've known since that time was announced, there's been cutbacks. And I just got Twitter's been a great resource to get updated information. There was delegation of elected Congress members who met with the White House today. I assume the president, because it says the White House. I just got a report 30 minutes ago that there's no assurance that any of the 207 billion targeted, additional 207 billion targeted to deal with the housing crisis is going to be included in the final bill. So everyone listening from around the country, if your Congress member and senator aren't already on board, it's not that they don't say they support it. You have to tell them, don't back any bill that doesn't include the housing funds. And it is multiracial, obviously, in the leadership. I mean, this is what makes it more potent. And I think this is one of the reasons why Biden included all this money in his bill, because I think the Congressional Black Caucus was very clear, and the Latino caucus, that their communities needed this money. So I don't even want to think about what happens if we don't get the money that we thought we were going to get, because the lobbying has been, the activism has been there.
So, based on your analysis, Biden is breaking the traditional kind of neoliberal consensus that we've seen for over 45, going back, as we said on the show, the 50-plus year counter-revolution, to actually try to put a major affordable housing plan in this Build Back Better bill. Do you think that because that's a result of reacting to the crisis post-COVID, or would you attribute that to the level of activism, or a combination of both?
It's probably a combination. I mean, I know Elizabeth Warren, who was really pro-housing in the primaries and really pushed for this big amount of money, was very influential with Biden to get him to do it. But what's so frustrating, Pascal and Jason, is that I run across people all the time where you see this online, where people say, well, all these activists keep saying it's a money issue. If it were a money issue, it would have been solved right now. Well, no, we never got the money. Homelessness began, it all started when Nixon got us out of the public housing business in the mid-'70s. Reagan then decimated the HUD budget, and the HUD budget was never restored to 1980 levels. And then people act like it was. Like, well, the problem wouldn't have existed this much if it was just money. Well, when you never get the money, the problem gets worse. And every year, more and more families are unable to afford market rents in the cities. So this was an opportunity to really reverse course for America. And we have to, the time is now to keep the pressure up. And then 125 Congress members signed a letter saying they're not going to support a bill without it. So we have a leadership, a lot of it coming out of New York City, people of color. And so it's a very diverse coalition.
Do you when you talk about the Department of Housing and Urban Development, what exactly has been their particular role in the overall trajectory of housing policy, would you argue, from the rise of Nixon going forward?
And I wanted to add to that question as well, Pascal. You say in your book, in the new preface, the rise of homelessness, you say, begins around 1980. It starts to get really bad and overblown. With the Reagan administration. So, what is the cause of that? And as Pascal is asking, HUD plays a massive role because HUD has been underfunded, as you talk about, from every president from 1980 to now. HUD has constantly been underfunded and also had some horrible heads.
Not to oversimplify what many believe is a complex question, but the reality is this. We had a lot of drug addiction in the 60s, alcohol addiction, mental health problems. We didn't have a homeless problem in the 60s. Why is that? Because low-income people who had substance abuse problems or had mental health problems could afford rent. In New York City, San Francisco, cities that now seem, By the late 1970s, a phenomenon developed where young people, known as yuppies, moved back to the cities after growing up in the suburbs. And so suddenly city urban real estate was rising in value. And just when, and pricing out the low income population, and just when those low income tenants needed Section 8 vouchers and needed government subsidies, we elect Ronald Reagan, who decimates the HUD budget in 1981. So there was a catastrophic decision made. I'm sorry to report, Democrats controlled the House in 1981. They could have stopped that cut. They didn't. And it's never been recovered. We've never had a president until now who said, you know, I'm going to put the kind of money. We've had Clinton and Obama, you know, they appoint good people to HUD, very good people to HUD, but there's no money. It doesn't matter how good you are. And then, of course, Republicans come in and they cut the budget and bring in terrible people like Trump did and what Bush did. You know, people who don't even have any interest in housing to begin with. So it's been a heads I win, tails you lose situation.
Another question I wanted to ask you, Randy, was one of the things that you make clear in your book is that basically housing is one of those housing and affordable housing issues is one of those policy concerns that we have that is very locally driven in terms of politics and policy. And you also talk about how, as a consequence of that, municipal elections have a much more significant role in determining housing policy than many people would be aware of in certain cities. In the wake of this kind of new contemporary left that we have post 2015, as you're talking about, how exactly can a political strategy be developed to affect municipal governing agencies and political bodies, to literally put in government officials who put the rights of working class people first to implement housing policy that can counter some of the noxious trends in gentrification and high price housing that we're seeing in urban centers from New York to California and all over the country? Do you think there's a certain strategy that can be implemented to counteract particularly the influence of the real estate in municipal governance?
And by the way, I see someone asking which one of my books. They're talking about Generation Priced Out, Who Gets to Live in the New Urban America, our paperback edition. In my book, I say one of the first steps, if you want to get more power for tenants, is to change elections so they coincide with national and state elections instead of local elections. In the first week of November, Boston, Cambridge, Boulder, Seattle are holding major elections off year. Now in Seattle, it's a mail-in ballot, which helps, but don't you think there'd be a lot more tenants and people and working class residents of color voting if it were tied in with the state and national election than a November 2021 election? LA finally changed. LA's politics were very hostile to new development until they changed the election cycle, which started in 2020. But we have a major election, like I would say in Seattle. I don't know if anyone here is listening from Seattle, but we have a huge election where Lorena Gonzalez, if she wins to become the first mayor of Latino mayor of Seattle, I mean, she would totally change the world for the city's low-income residents in a positive way. Her opponent would keep it the way it is. So some of these elections are really important. But as a political strategy, deciding to have off-year elections is disempowering. And the turnouts just aren't what they otherwise would be. And the people who disproportionately vote are white homeowners in these low turnout elections.
Right. And one of the things that I found really fascinating about your suggestion, you make this point very clear in your book, is that one of your most important suggestions for addressing affordable housing crisis, particularly gentrification, and I'd really like you to elaborate this strategy, is to basically end a single-family zoning laws, single-family housing.
Well, yeah, it's been a battle in California. We finally just did it and allowed duplexes, but a lot of people don't think of anything that gets built as evil developers building housing. But the reality is in most of Los Angeles, which has the worst homeless problem in the United States, you can't build an apartment building for homeless people in most neighborhoods. San Francisco can't solve its homeless problem without changing existing zoning. I don't think any city can, because when you ban luxury apartments, you're banning all apartments. And we've allowed Austin, all the cities I talk about in my book, we've allowed all these progressive cities to have vast stretches of the city where there's no tenants allowed.
Well,
that's madness.
Well, I want to get on that because, you know, there is a kind of thought process on some people, mostly you see it on the online left, where they say, I'm done with electoral politics. No one can do anything. There's someone in the chat who is talking about the mayoral race that you're speaking on doesn't matter because Amazon is too powerful. I mean, I would definitely challenge them with Kashama Sawant, who won a city council, who's won multiple times her city council seat going against those two behemoths that spent millions against the city council members. So, I mean, things can't happen. And she has made changes in certain housing.
Anyone in Seattle who thinks that it doesn't matter who's mayor, just ask yourself, if Seattle had elected Carrie Moon over Jenny Durkin 4 years ago, what a different city Seattle would be today. I don't think anyone can dispute that. So mayoral elections mean a lot.
But getting into electoral politics and kind of getting into the weeds of what you talk about a lot in your book, a lot of what you say that is causing gentrification and holding up building of housing is policy. SB 50, that State Senator Scott Wiener was trying to pass. It didn't pass. And now we have was it SB 9 and SB 10 that would allow multi-unit housing to be built in single-family residences. And there's a massive pushback to do that. What role does electoral politics play in a place like California, for example, where you have a state assembly that's kind of captured by the real estate lobby?
Well, electoral politics, that you hit, your last statement is really the essence, in that electoral politics, you know, when someone says I don't mean about electoral politics, then they're not really going to be involved in housing policy because it's all done by elected officials. And so, but I find that people I know get very frustrated with California state's government. They see it as has a supermajority of Democrats, but it's owned by the real estate industry for the most part. And what you get is around the edges. It's amazing we've gotten what we've gotten given how the real estate industry, and the problem we have is that in many states, like in California, realtors are in every assembly district. There's always a real estate office in multiple ones in every assembly district, but there aren't active tenant groups in every assembly district, right? Like the Central Valley parts. And so there's always lobbyists for real estate. And when you elect people who feel like there's no one in their district who cares about rent control, but there's a lot of people who oppose it, they're not going to be voting with your way at the state level. So it's understandably frustrating why people feel like electoral politics don't work. But in housing policy, that decides where we go with money. And had we not elected Ronald Reagan, we probably would never have had a homeless problem. And that's a big statement, but I believe if we kept the original budget, if Carter won that election, we would have expanded Section 8 instead of killing it.
What do you think about that, Pascal?
I mean, I'm not going to make the argument that electoral politics is irrelevant, but I mean, the fact that, you know, housing is something in which you're dealing with budgetary constraints that you're dealing with the government. I mean, it absolutely makes sense that how are you going to address a housing crisis if you're not dealing with, you know, political officials that are willing to allocate resources to doing that? That absolutely makes sense. But the question that I ask is that how do you deal with the reality where, particularly in these municipalities or in a state situation like California, you have the real estate industry and the real estate lobbies that have so much power? For example, I'm from New York City. And one of the things that I find particularly noxious about urban real estate planning and development, particularly around issues of gentrification and so on and so forth, is how members of the Black political class in these cities are able to use racial allegiance of the urban population to win elections Yet at the same time, there is not a municipal city in America that did not have a black mayor at the time some of the worst gentrification policies were being implemented in this country. And I think about right now the situation in New York with Eric Adams, who's the new mayor, who is being celebrated by not only the black political class, but many black citizens as the resurgence of black political authority in New York City. This guy got more money from the real estate development lobby than any other candidate in New York City.
Well, Pascal, you this is for a separate show, but you make a really great point that people haven't talked about enough, which is that working class people, brown and black voters in New York City put him in office.
Mm-hmm.
They elected him, even though he's a real estate person. You know, Bill de Blasio was a huge real estate recipient, huge. And people wonder why his housing policy hired Bill, as I say in the book, Goldman Sachs, he hired a Goldman Sachs person to be the director of housing. Bill de Blasio, Mr. Progressive, hired a Goldman Sachs person. And we say, well, how can that be? Well, he was a major recipient of real estate funds in his campaign, even though he was the progressive candidate. So one thing New York City did, though, the activists in New York City, through the Working Families Party in 2018, went up and changed the election map of New York and elected a state senate, got rid of the conservative Democrats, primaried them all, and then at the state level, totally strengthened rent control and tenant protection. So New York is an example of what could happen. We can't seem to do that in California. It's a lot harder because of just the dynamics of state and how we have so many people living in places like the Central Valley as opposed to big cities. But I personally am involved in trying to get legislation for tenants through the California legislature. And let me tell you, it is difficult. It is challenging. And you deal with people who are Democrats, who are backed by labor, get all their funding from labor. Labor's 100% labor score. They're with real estate.
We had a candidate on this show that was running in Oakland, Janani Rashandaran.
Fantastic. I endorsed her and gave her, she's fantastic.
And I think she was the only person that would have been, if elected, and sadly she didn't win. If elected, I think she would have been the only person that rented in the state.
There's no renters in the legislature.
Oh, there's two renters. Okay.
I mean, we wonder why we have problems. And, we do have many, many very great legislators in California and other states, but real estate is everywhere in this state. And it's hard. But, the stuff at the local level, it doesn't explain why cities that don't have that, cities, you can have more power on rent control. You can enact your own rent control laws in cities. Outside of Massachusetts, where they ban it, and actually, I don't know if people realize, in roughly 40 states, cities can't enact rent control, even though that's an essential affordability solution. That's the problem Seattle has. Portland went up there and they got a state exemption. Oregon totally changed everything. But Seattle cannot enact rent control unless the state legislature authorizes it. Isn't that crazy?
And the state
legislature, all the rents, high rents in Seattle.
I mean, what's crazy is like these state legislature elections also happen with very, very low voter turnout.
And many of these things, these laws, anti-rent control laws, are passed like 30 years ago when we didn't have rent. Seattle wasn't an expensive city then. Yeah. But, Seattle is an interesting point because I do think I see a lot of comments about Seattle on the chat room that if you take a step back, Seattle was moving in the direction of San Francisco in terms of being progressive. And by electing the wrong mayor, and there was a great council candidate they didn't elect, and the sort of homeowner influence has halted the city's progress. And hopefully Lorena Gonzalez will win in November.
In your book, you speak to a YIMBY movement, which would be the antithetical to the NIMBY movement. But there is some critique of the YIMBY movement as well.
Well, I just got in a big fight with San Francisco YIMBY because there was a project in the Tenderloin that we opposed. And, people.
Can you tell us about the project and why you opposed it?
Yeah, it's a project. It was a 172 unit family housing project, which we totally supported, and all of our residents in the Tenderloin were supportive. Then after it got approved, the owner of the building changed the developer, redesigned the project. So it was a 316 group housing units without kitchens. And virtually no family units at all. So we said, wait a minute, we wanted family housing. Our neighborhood has thousands of kids. They have no place to live within suitable housing, and they refused to budge. And so we all opposed it. And people tweeted to me and emailed me saying I'm a hypocrite. I say I'm for housing, but I never say anywhere in my books, you should support every project a developer comes up with, as bad as it is. And so we Tenderloin Housing Clinic, which I'm the head of, appealed the planning commission approved the project 4-2, and we appealed it to the board of supervisors, and a week and a half ago we won 11-0. We stopped the project, and we had a powerful statement from the supervisors that we need family housing in the Tenderloin, not more housing for single adults.
Now you talk about San Francisco has a few quote unquote progressives on their city council. Even
We have a
a
board of
socialist.
supervisors. We are probably, by the traditional definition of progressive, probably have the most progressive local government by the traditional definition.
Oh, just with Chase Boudin alone.
I mean, the challenge with San Francisco, which I talk about in my book, is that we have the strongest rent controls in the country. We have the strongest tenant protections. We have the strongest housing protections. We have the strongest laws, all these things. But the city is still super expensive because we don't build enough housing. I mean, that's the problem, is that to be progressive in San Francisco has long meant I'm going to take care of the people who are here. The fact that working class people can no longer afford to live here isn't my problem. I think it should be. I think just if you're young and you're working in middle class, you should be able to live in San Francisco. And we shouldn't just have politics that only care about the existing population.
Well, hasn't that been kind of a push for some of these strikes we've seen with teachers in places like Los Angeles and even Oakland to actually have affordable housing in the cities they live in? I speak about this constantly. The LA Times has done some pretty good work about housing in California, but a few years back, maybe like 7 years or so ago, the most expensive overbidding for a house in the state history was in Sunnyvale, California. It was like $865,000 over asking for a 3 and a 2. And Sunnyvale is just kind of your average suburban community, but there's still schools there. So where does the mailman live? Where do the teachers live?
In Sunnyvale, they sleep in their cars because they can't afford it. It's a 3-hour commute from where they can afford to live. I mean, that's the society that we've created in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles. I have a chapter in my book on Los Angeles and generation priced out, and you have people living in converted garages. Because when you say you're going to live an hour away in Los Angeles, people in the Bay Area think they have traffic. Visit LA on a commute day, and you know what real traffic is.
Yeah. And you talk about this in your book as well, that housing is also an environmental issue. And I know you mentioned this before the first time you were on the show, but there's a lot of new viewers now that didn't catch that episode. Can you get into why housing is an environmental issue as well?
Well, when you give people jobs in a city, but then you give them no place they can afford to live, they have to commute from a vast distance. I talk how many, the staggering number, 150,000 people were commuting from Sacramento to the Bay Area. Well, they're driving.
That's like a 2.5 to 3 hour drive.
So think of what that means. I once did a talk someone told me I did a talk in Fremont, which is in the South Bay, and person told me he works at UC Berkeley, and he's in his group of 40 people he had in his little group, work group in Berkeley. None of them could afford to live in Berkeley. So if you have people having to drive long distances, Vacaville, Fairfield, that's terrible for the environment. Infill housing means you could Berkeley is crazy. Berkeley is now changing politically, but for a long time, you couldn't build an apartment in most of Berkeley. The apartments you saw in Berkeley were built before the zoning change in the 60s.
And was that largely because of the single-family housing zoning legislation?
Yeah, and I discuss it in my book how Berkeley was founded. They had the first in the nation neighborhood preservation ordinance, and well-meaning people did it, but it was like neighborhood preservation means keep out apartments, and they'd say they didn't want ticky-tack apartments. And what I say in the book is, well, that's where probably the janitors at UC Berkeley could afford to live. Mm-hmm. But not everyone can afford a house. But if we're going to not let apartments, you're basically saying, and it's racially driven, of course. That's why these neighborhoods that are single family zoned are heavily white in Berkeley, because people of color can't afford to live there. So, when segregation laws ended in 1964, and then the Fair Housing Act of 66, communities came up with other creative ways to keep people of color out, and they chose zoning restrictions. In Austin, they have lot restrictions where you have to have a certain size lot to build. Well, that means you have to build a mansion. And who can afford to build a mansion?
So the question becomes, is that in this reality, understanding that it takes a significant amount of understanding of housing policy, housing law, housing history, and understanding the role of the real estate developers in developing that history, how exactly do we work on growing the housing activist core and the people who can, most effectively fight the policies that are basically pushing this kind of, housing crisis? We're looking about right now. We have, hedge funds and asset holders like BlackRock that are buying up,
New
not only
developments,
apartment buildings, but,
new single families,
new single family housing all over the country. And it almost looks as if, and this has been going on since the 2008 crash. I remember even some of the banks post crash were buying up a lot of these recently foreclosed properties. And it's looking more and more, based on the movements of the financial institutions, that we're almost moving to a kind of feudal society where no one's going to be able to no less rent, but even think about owning a home or anything of that nature. So what exactly can be done to stem the tide of these policies? Does it take a crisis like COVID that causes the Democrats in Congress right now to wake up? Or what exactly are some steps as a lifelong housing activist do you think can be taken?
People ask me when I do book events, like, why do you think these homeowners will change their view? And actually, I think there's been success in educating people who are not reactionary people. They consider themselves liberal Democrats, that to explain to them why banning apartments is bad and undermines. They have a Black Lives Matter sign in their door while they say to ban apartments. The two don't really match. And I think we're having success. I mean, you talk about the new mayor of New York, the likely new mayor of New York City. He supports affordable housing, upzoning Soho, an upscale neighborhood in New York City, for affordable housing. One thing that a lot of people have found common cause in is we can avoid the whole gentrification issue. Let's go to completely gentrified neighborhoods and build affordable housing. How can you be against that? And I think that's something. Like Cambridge had 100% affordable housing overlay, which would allow you to build affordable housing in any neighborhood. And I think that gets people excited about real change. And I know Berkeley is only 100,000 people. It's not the best ideal example, but in Berkeley, it used to be you'd go to a land use hearing and the only people who spoke were the people opposed to a project. Politics changed, and now students are mobilized and they come down and support projects that can house students and things. So it's really expanding the base. We've had a large silent majority to allow apartments to be built everywhere, to not just limit apartments to a few neighborhoods in every city. But those people have not been engaged. They haven't come out. They don't get involved. And that's changing in cities all across America. So that's what I chronicle in Generation Priced Out, how that was all started. So I think there's reason for optimism, but also, as you point out, Pascal, Jason, the forces of the status quo and of keeping every city rich and only for the rich are powerful. And, if we were to lose this battle over the budget in Washington, I think it'd be very psychologically destructive. Because, if we can't get the money now, sure, we can try to convince people that, okay, we have to change the Senate in 2 years, go vote. But I think a lot of people who fought for this housing money and to end homelessness are going to be very discouraged.
And it was these activists that pushed hard for Governor Gavin Newsom to do something during the early stages of the COVID crisis. And we get Operation Room Key, where money is given to hotels and motels to temporarily shelter in place our unhoused citizens. Of course, the project did not work as well in Los Angeles. I definitely have my opinions about that. It worked a little better, in my opinion, in the Bay Area, well, at least the East Bay, and places like Oakland. Actually, down south in Fremont had quite a few units, and some of the hotels that were part of the project were higher end hotels like Marriott's. I definitely worked at the Radisson in East Oakland. But one thing I will say about these areas, they were in extremely depressed locations. The hotels that were not doing it were in the downtown areas. The Fairmont in San Francisco, for sure, was not doing it. Neither was the Four Seasons and all that other good stuff. But
Well, you're raising an issue of segregation, which people don't like to talk about. But when you ban apartments from neighborhoods, you're basically having racial segregation.
Yeah.
And these are liberal cities. I say in my book, these blue cities all practice policies that promote segregation, but they're progressive, so no one wants to look at them carefully. But I think that's changing. One thing about the Project Roomkey thing is San Francisco bought a hotel for homeless people that I'd been very involved with in the 1980s. It's called the Hotel Diva on Geary Street in the Square.
And I know it well. So did Diva got bought in Roomkey or before Roomkey?
No,
wow. Diva's nice.
It's a tourist hotel, but I was involved, and there was a New York Times article about it which talks about my involvement. I was involved where all the tenants are facing eviction and they wanted to convert the hotel to tourist, and we stopped the eviction of all the tenants, got them all lifetime leases, which was great. But that hotel was allowed to convert to tourists when it never should have. And the city agency just illegally let it be tourist. And it's really bothered me for the past 35 years that we lost the Diva Hotel and now we got it back. So I'm kind of happy about that. You can kind of reverse gentrify.
The Diva, Pascal, was the last time I hung out with Biz Marquis and DJ Cool V.
Oh, okay.
They were staying
at Geary. It used to be the Somerton Hotel when I was involved.
It's I know the location. It's right smack dab in the middle of I can't think right now.
Square. David Square. Is right nearby. Geary Street Theater is right there.
It's right there. So the Diva is part of Roomkey. That's interesting.
I see a comment about public housing. One of the things that the Reagan budget particularly did was decimate public housing. And then we had Bill Clinton come in with his reform of public housing, which ended up saving public housing by demolishing over 100,000 family units. I wonder how many people listening to this show know that happened under the Clinton administration. Mm-hmm. It was to save public housing. They claimed the units couldn't be salvaged, but we didn't replace them. In San Francisco, Willie Brown, of all people, made sure that every unit was replaced one for one. We never lost a housing unit in San Francisco. Nationally, just think we lost 100,000 family housing units because that was how Bill Clinton wanted to fix public housing. So now there's an effort to build social housing in California. There's a bill to do it, to follow the European model. And let's hope that happens because obviously public housing is a more government-funded housing, government-owned housing can be more cost effective if it's done right. But if you don't fund it and it's done wrong, like America's done it wrong for the last 50 years, it's a disaster.
Well, would you both agree? This question is for Pascal and Randy. Would you both agree that for the most part, the way we view public, not we as the people on the show, but the way public housing is viewed is very punitive? Would you guys agree?
Yes,
absolutely. I mean, there's a class outlook to the concept of public housing as well. It's like, this is where the poor Black and brown people are. Like, you don't want that stuff in your neighborhood. That's the last thing you want to be around. And that's one of the deterrents to have it being invested in.
There's a great documentary that's widely available on about Pruitt, St. Louis's Pruitt Igloo project.
Oh, Pruitt Igo.
Notorious Pruitt, and it tells the true story, how it was a real community until the government stopped funding it. And then it was like the tenants are all bad people. It was a racial demonization, an extreme racial demonization that they got away with under Democrats as well as Republicans. It was bipartisan.
Mm-hmm. Someone brought up a question that's really interesting to me. What are your thoughts on the role of the Hope Six, the Clinton's Hope Six program, and its effect on housing? Because I remember when Hope Six was being rolled out, and particularly a lot of members of the Black political class were cheerleading Hope Six. I know Charlie Rangel in New York was a big advocate of Hope Six, and major urban areas were big fans of Hope Six. But what I find interesting is that after the Hope Six initiative, that's actually when you start to see some of the really early patterns of gentrification starting to develop in these cities. Now, you would know better than I. I was wondering, is there a correlation? Is there a correlation or causal effect? But I really would like you to talk about the connection between Hope Six, which was a Clinton program, and the development of gentrification in these urban areas.
Well, Pruitt-Igoe was an example of how they demolished public housing to gentrify the area. I mean, the assumption was if you have it's totally false because there's a public housing project that used to be called Valencia Gardens. It might still be that on Valencia Street in Guerrero in the Mission District in a very upscale area. And the public housing has not affected real estate values at all. But there's the perception that if we could just get rid of that public housing, like demolish it. And you make a very important point about people like Charles Rangel, who also, I think, supported the crime bill of 94.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
You know, I understand when you're in that position, you have to make tough decisions and when there's not a lot of resources. And I think what happened, I know what happened with Hope Six is that someone like Rangel figures, hey, public housing is not going to survive. This is the only way we can get the money. But it was pointed out at the time, it was being negotiated and dealt with that they would potentially destroy 100,000 units. That was contemplated. That wasn't like, oh, we did this and look what happened. It was contemplated. So Pascal, when you're planning on destroying 100,000 units, why would you do that if not to gentrify surrounding neighborhoods? What would be your motive?
Wow. So what you're saying is that the destruction of those public housing units via Hope Six basically creates the spacing motivation to allow that gentrification and development of new properties that are going to be tailored to more affluent residents.
Right. And the tragedy of it is that there's a lot of articles and things written about this. It's not true that public housing brings down adjacent property values. You know, the whole history of public housing is a tragedy because public housing was intentionally destroyed by the real estate industry as a competition. You know, if you look at other countries, they have social housing and they don't have any of the issues.
Well, it's very anti-communist. There's a lot of, before even McCarthyism, there was an anti-communist sentiment in even the teardown of Chavez Ravine.
Well, the New Deal, from the very start, there was opposition to public housing. After the National Housing Act passed in 1949, from the very beginning, they were attacking it and stopping it from being built. So the real estate industry never stopped trying to stop public housing. And then when Nixon killed it, the problem was that there were Democrats who had complaints from their district. They were fine. We're not going to defend public housing because it's failed. It's a failed liberal experiment. That's what they all called it. When in fact, it was extremely successful until real estate interests got it defunded. Even NICA in New York City, which used to be held up as the gold standard of public housing, they didn't provide heat for what, like 18 months? They had no heat, no elevators in New York City.
Where they're built on top of everything. Yeah. What's fascinating to me is when I found out about the story of Chavez Ravine, you know, the original, so years before even Dodger Stadium is built, it's this ramshackle homemade area of mostly Mexican residents, and there was a plan to actually build public housing, parks, I think even a school. And this is like they built their own housing. Like there was no plumbing lines. So we're talking open trenches of sewers. There's no garbage, but they did have mail delivery. And the city was going to build this housing. So they bought the houses from the people for under market. So they couldn't go immediately to the areas near them because there were still racist covenants on deeds. And they were kind of stuck. the ones that did sell, a few stayed. I think a few hundred or so stayed. The city ends up bulldozing those houses for the stadium.
Yeah, my
Because
recollection is the redevelopment agency took land in Chavez Ravine by eminent domain,
at the end,
and then they used it to build a baseball stadium.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be for housing. You know, Chavez Ravine is one of those stories that got written out. It was blacked out. If you look at the LA Times coverage of that whole thing, they were so excited to get a stadium and the Dodgers to come. They just it was a disgraceful.
Did you know they were part of the communist red baiting, the LA Times? Did you know that?
LA Times has a terrible history.
Yeah, they were part of they blacklisted the architect so bad that he had to like stop being an architect because they called him a communist, and he was not. He was not a communist by any stretch of the imagination. They were just trying to build housing, but that was.
You know, what's interesting is many newspapers, you know, they're funded by the real estate, historically funded by real estate ads, and they serve the real estate industry's agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really a problem. You know, Seattle Times is very anti-housing, and so that's been a problem when it comes to endorsements. These newspapers endorse the pro-real estate candidate.
It's, you know, someone's bringing up another really fascinating thing about Chicago is about how public housing was destroyed in Chicago. Also around, ironically, around the same time as the neoliberal Clinton age, politicians are taking sway in America and into the millennium. And I was reading an article that explained how the destruction of public housing in Chicago has a direct correlation to the increase of violent crime and homicides in Chicago that we've seen in the last 2 years. Because what it did is that it basically caused all of the traditional hierarchies of the gangs that have been kind of respected as this turf is here, don't cross there, to be destroyed. And it caused rival competing factions to have to, interact with each other in a way that proliferated the increase of violent crime. I was wondering, I don't know if you were familiar with that.
I am. I do want to mention before we break that, I've spent my whole career for 40 years working in San Francisco's Tenderloin. When I got to the Tenderloin in 1980, everybody said it was guaranteed on track for gentrification. We're between Union Square and City Hall. And 40 years later, we're still a very low-income community. And I wrote a book called The Tenderloin, Sex, Crime, and Resistance in the Heart of San Francisco that is available from AK Press online. And I think people who want to know how you can stop gentrification when it seems inevitable, look at what we did in the Tenderloin, because we did a lot of things. And I wish I wrote a book also, The Activist Handbook, that's strategies for stopping gentrification, because a lot of things can happen. It's hard when public housing is involved because the political power is so great and they take power away. They give it to redevelopment agencies, which are undemocratic. There's a lot of strategies the adversaries, our opposition uses, but there's strategies we have also at our disposal that many communities don't use. So we have to be a little very strategic in combating these real threats of gentrification and displacement.
Well, Randy, are you going to be joining us on the bonus patron half for another? Can we get another at least 20 minutes out of you? Because we got a couple more questions we want to ask.
How about 15?
We will squeeze 15 solid minutes of non-bullshittery.
Okay.
Out of you, and I appreciate your time so much.
That's okay.
So put a pin in your question, Pascal. I see you pissed off now because I had to put a pin in it. Look at you.
No, I'm not pissed off at all. I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm really glad we had Randy on. I think we just had a high-powered hour. We touched a lot of bases, and even though we've had Randy on 3 times, we got to have him on again to really parse out these solutions to these complex questions around housing, gentrification, because one of the things I like about his book is that he gives really tangible solutions addressing these problems. And, as someone, I worked in real estate, I had a real estate practice. And I when people ask me a solution to gentrification, I always say, I'll be very honest with you. This is a very complex issue, and I really don't know what the silver bullet is to address this. But Randy's book is chock full of solutions on how to address these problems. One of the things he says is you got to stop single family housing zoning. Next, you got to have affordable housing built into legislation. Which means price control on housing. I mean, there's quite a few things he talks about, and it's very, very important. No, I was not a real estate agent at a real estate market.
Also, if for Bay Area people watching this show, and I know there's a good amount of Bay Area people watching this show, Randy, what is the name of your organization?
The Tenderloin Housing Clinic.
Are you accepting any volunteers at all?
We don't really use volunteers, but people couldn't, when we have campaigns, people want to support. I also write for beyondchron.org regularly, beyondchron.org, write about politics, housing, the whole bit, once a week on Tuesdays. People should subscribe to that. I think that housing is a big issue. I should come back on your show if we win this battle in DC, because this would be historic. I will be writing about it because, one thing I say in the Activist Handbook, there are some times when activists do everything right and don't win. Right? I mean, all you can do as an activist is make sure you do everything right. And this has been a phenomenal campaign to get this money. And again, some of these New York City guys, Richie Torres has been very involved in leading it in Congress. Hakeem Jeffries, who's generally not that progressive, but he's the fourth, one of the leaders in Congress. Every step, everything has been done to maximize pressure to get this money. And we have to get it because we're never how can we stop homelessness if we don't spend the money to house affordable housing?
No, you're right. And on that note, everybody, we are going into the bonus patron end. So I'm going to send you a new link, Randy.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to leave with chill music, and cartoons are for patrons. So